Thanks for joining us. Our panel's called The Wild West of Energy. You guys can come up and join me on stage. Just to give a little background on myself, I'm the CEO of Smead Capital Management. Like Bob Metcalf said yesterday, well, unlike Bob Metcalf, I don't have any paradigms or anything like that tied to me. But I am a George Gilder fanboy, which I think there's quite a few in the room. So I'd love to introduce my guests here. On my far right, your far left, is Kent Walter. He serves as the Director of Western Market Affairs for Arizona Public Service. Kent's responsibility includes Western market policy, intermediate planning, and operational support / analytics. He has 17 years of experience in the power sector. To his left is Jonathan Lesser. He is a senior fellow with Discovery Institute. He is also a senior fellow with the National Center for Energy Analytics and the president of Continental Economics, an energy consulting firm. He hails, unlike Kent from the Southwestern Arizona, he hails from New Mexico. So we have a couple of Southwesterners. And then the real oddball in the mix is my Canadian friend to my right here, Mark Mills. Mark is the Executive Director of Energy Realities. He's also a senior fellow of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Alongside Jonathan, he's also a fellow with the National Center for Energy Analytics. He's a contributing editor of City Journal, partner at Montrose Lane, and more importantly, if you know Mark Mills at all, he was the author, co-author of The Bottomless Well in 2006 and The Cloud Revolution, his book in 2021. So we already, Mark, I like this morning, a lot of your writing has been kind of what I've got my framework for thinking about. And so to hear Jevons Paradox already uttered this morning was just like music to my ears. And I'm sure that might come up in our discussion. So we'll get to that later because again, I don't want to get into someone else's panel, George, and tell people what's right or wrong in the way that you would. So I'm going to leave, and I don't want to talk about China or anything yet, but we'll get to that too. So I want to start with Jonathan. Jonathan, you've done quite a bit of work around utility policies in states like Washington and Oregon. Can you just teach our audience, just from the outset, what does the production of energy for the utilities of those two states look like today? Where does that sit? Again, I live in the state of Arizona. We don't have much water, so we biasly think, oh, there's a ton of water in the Northwest. That must be where they get most of their energy. Can you teach us about what the current production makeup is?
Sure. The current makeup is it's a fair amount of hydro, thanks to the development of the federal electric hydro power system on the Columbia River. Then it's natural gas. There's a little bit of nuclear, less than there used to be. And there's still one coal plant in Washington State, which is going to close next year. And some of the utilities also receive import power, primarily coal, from Wyoming, Nevada. So that's the mix today.
Okay. And your work has been tied to, obviously, the, I'll call it the mandates, that's how I think about it, this idea of net zero, okay? If that's the state of affairs today, where would be the plans to go to in those energy production, means to get the electricity, mandates of the future in this net zero idea?
Well, both Oregon and Washington have numerous mandates. Both are requiring the electric utilities in their respective states to be zero emissions in 2040 in Oregon, 2045 in Washington State. Both have implemented California's advanced clean car rules, which kick in next year and will require 35% of all new vehicles sold in the states to be electric. Next year, that increases to 82% by 2032 and 100% by 2035. There's also similar regulations for large trucks. Then they're also requiring electrification of buildings. Oregon has mandated that no new buildings can have natural gas installed. In Washington, they haven't passed any laws, but they've changed the building code, so it's effectively impossible to install natural gas. They're also, in Washington State, they've implemented a carbon tax. They call it misleadingly cap and invest. It's really a cap and trade program cap, where they take, it's raised about $2 billion so far. Oregon would have passed that same sort of cap and trade system, except the Oregon Republicans walked out of the legislature. This was last year. And so they didn't have a quorum to pass that. So, and then there's some advanced clean fuels initiatives which require that the carbon content of fossil fuels be reduced. For those of you who are chemists, you might wonder, well, how can you reduce the carbon content of fossil fuels? Because that's basically in the chemistry. It basically involves buying credits to offset the carbon in those fuels. And again, the goal is to go full 100% electrification by 2050 and meet the needs, the demand for electricity, which will obviously skyrocket with wind, solar, and storage.
So Ken, in comparison in Arizona, can you give us a picture of what that looks like today? Because I read the New York Times and I trust everything they say. I know you have no water there, okay? And so could you kind of teach us, if you don't have water, you're not doing hydro, how do you get, power in a desert?
Yeah, absolutely. Kent Walter from Arizona. The desert is an interesting place to have power because we don't have a lot of these natural things. We don't have natural gas that we have locally. We get our natural gas from Texas and New Mexico, and we bring that in. We have a lot of sunshine, and we have kind of the gem of the desert, which is Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, which we are the operator of. We have a balanced portfolio of resources. So at the end of the day, utilities are risk managers. We will have to make sure our customers are reliable at the lowest cost possible. And to do that requires a lot of different diverse resources. So our mix includes quite a bit of nuclear energy. So 20% of our energy comes from nuclear, 25% from natural gas, 15% from coal, and then the balance from renewables, purchase power, and demand side management. Now, what's interesting is you hear me talk about the percentages of energy, but as a utility planner and as a risk manager, we don't just think about where our energy comes from. We have to think about where our reliability comes from. And so when we think about our reliability, we think about where our kind of peak needs come from, because when it's 118 degrees in Arizona, it's a life and death issue for our customers that we stay reliable. And so our portfolio looks really different, where we're the majority natural gas for our reliability for our customers, as compared to the things that I mentioned that are meeting some of our energy needs.
So you mentioned nuclear. Obviously, nuclear is like the new cool kids thing to talk about for energy and all that kind of stuff. Mark, you were it's kind of on that topic. When I think of nuclear, I think of Homer Simpson, obviously, is the most famous candid example of nuclear, which is actually based on the Columbia River, the nuclear stations that were off the Columbia River. Mark, you came here for ultimately nuclear as a Canadian coming across the border. This heightened interest in nuclear, how do you see this? Because it obviously requires a lot of capital investment, depending on what we do, and then also efficiencies and technologies. Can you kind of talk to us about where you see nuclear going? Because ultimately, it's been this thing, commented earlier, it's been around for years, and yet it's still highly debated. I mean, just as an example, I think Japan had 53 nuclear reactors, and then Fukushima happens, and they go down to, I think, 3. So kind of in the pendulum swing of nuclear.
Well, everybody's excited about nukes. It's the cool kid thing, especially in my friends in the tech community. Everybody's clapping like seals in the Embarcadero about nuclear energy now, about we're going to run our data centers on nukes. I'm delighted that the tech industry is throwing billions of dollars at nuclear energy. It needs money. I'm glad it's going to be their money, not taxpayers' money. So I'd like the tech industry to fund it, not DOE, which funds yesterday's technologies, not tomorrow's. But to answer your question, I do want to answer George's question because it's relevant. George said, "What is Jevons Paradox?" And it is very relevant to the answer, because William Stanley Jevons, a 19th century British economist, coined a phrase that he knew was not a paradox to describe what good economists do when they discover the obvious. And it happens occasionally with economists. I mean, it doesn't happen very often. I'm a physicist, and I like to think that economists episodically discover fundamental laws. What Jevons discovered was that if you make it more efficient to produce something that's valuable, people will consume more of it. What a shock. So what he wrote in his paper in the 19th century was that the paradox was, and his words were exactly this. You can still find the paper online. It's on a PDF. He wrote that it may seem a paradox that as we improve the efficiency of coal mining and coal combustion, that the consumption of coal will go up. And of course, he went on to point out that it made the service it provided cheaper. So efficiency drives demand, with very, very few exceptions, because it lowers costs, inputs go down. This is relevant to the demand for electricity, the demand for energy in general. Certainly the question that was posed in a previous session about what happens as we improve the efficiency of compute, going from chips to tiles. Well, we know the answer to that because we've already done it. There's about a billion-fold improvement in the energy efficiency of a logic operation since mainframe days. And of course, we went from a few thousand computers to billions of computers. We went from unmeasurable trivial quantities of energy used to do compute and communication to today where global compute cloud uses more energy than global aviation, and the former is growing faster than the latter. And we will again improve the efficiency of compute by another billion-fold, I think, as we go to the graphene paradigm, the paradigm, to follow with Bob, as we do, because we're not at physics limits yet with new materials, and that will increase the demand for electricity for compute. It won't eliminate demand, it will accelerate it. Nuclear power will play a role, because it can play a role, because it's the only phenomenology that's profoundly better than hydrocarbons. Wind and solar are profoundly worse in rough material terms, in terms of footprint of materials used, mining done, land used. Going from hydrocarbons to wind solar increases the footprint on the Earth by 1,000-fold. If you go from hydrocarbons to nuclear, you decrease your footprint to produce electricity by 1,000-fold. So obviously, markets will go nuclear, but that will provide nominally a third of the world's energy. All the materials processes need to make the magic materials to make everything possible require high temperature processes where hydrocarbons come in again. So the laws of physics eventually beat the aspirations of bureaucrats.
So Kent, in your notes, you had an interesting point that I want to bring up. So I'm a large business. I have huge energy needs. And I come to APS and say, hey, Kent, I want to use fully renewable energy. We've decided, our board came in, our independent directors, for whatever reason, decided we have to do it because it's what God said, okay? How do you do that for an enterprise business that comes to you with that mandate? Because ultimately, can't I just pay a higher price to get the renewable energy I want that wouldn't affect the other customers?
Yeah, we've taken our approach to clean energy and clean energy attribution to really be in a position of being an enabler, right? So not every customer values the same things as when it comes to their energy mix. And so what we've done is we've created a number of different products for our customers to be able to participate in so that they can get attribution to certain renewables. So one of the things we've done that's a little bit different is we've invited our customers to be able to participate in our procurement process, where if they want to pay the incremental cost to get some of these different types of resources, that's fine. It holds everybody else indifferent. And so for this year, for example, we'll collect something like $20 million of customers who have said, hey, I would like to have you procure a renewable resource versus another type of resource. And next year we'll be at $30 million, and that will continue to grow as we have more customers. And in that way, we're enabling customers to be able to have that renewable future that they want for those that want it, but not necessarily layering on the cost to those that maybe don't value the same things.
And that kind of brings up, there's I'll call it the open market price for the utility that they charge all customers. And then obviously some elect to not take that open market price and they take a higher market price because of the type of energy they want to use. So Jonathan, I wanted to bring it to you can you kind of teach us about, what are the market pricing structures in this space? I mean, if I'm going to use Mills writing, it takes energy to move energy. Okay, and so there's wholesale prices, there's in-market issues. Can you kind of teach us about the pricing structures across these state lines and utilities for this?
Well, I'll try. It's complicated. There's retail pricing.
Well, that's why I asked you the question.
Well, you don't want to ask a physicist because they always pretend to be economists and they get everything wrong. So,
But our laws win.
so let's go from the retail backwards. So retail electric prices are all regulated. They're set by public utility commissions who say this is how much you charge. They determine how costs are allocated between different classes of customers, residential, commercial, industrial. And then if you move back, in a lot of markets, you have electric utilities that are no longer vertically integrated. They don't own generation. Sometimes they own transmission, but they always own local distribution. So those prices for transmission, those are set by FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And then for generation, it's typically market-based. So in some parts of the country, primarily in the eastern part, but also California, you have wholesale markets which have been created. They're basically artificial markets. They're very complicated. The rules are, well, the best word I can think of is insane, to regulate prices. But it's not just the actual energy. They have prices for capacity and then various reliability attributes, like because you have to have, as Kent was talking about reliability, you have to have generators that are on standby, or it's called spinning reserve, that can be on very quickly. You have generators that can be ramped up and down instantaneously to respond to changes in demand. So all this has to combine, and what you get with, say, a lot of wind and solar, that's really disrupting the wholesale markets, because A, they don't have the same qualities. They're intermittent, and so you can't rely on them. And then they increase price volatility, because when there's lots of sun and lots of wind, prices collapse. In California, they call it a duck curve. And in a lot of cases in California, they actually have to pay, the state of California pays other utilities out of state to take the power because there's so much excess solar. So it's really a mess right now. And unfortunately, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Okay, and I want to touch on one thing, and then we're going to pivot to a slide of Mark's. But so Ken, to kind of follow on that of like what you pay for someone to do that seems odd, but yet we call that the utility business. When I put solar panels up in my house in the municipality of Phoenix, okay, I can be using some of the power I'm generating, okay? But what do you pay those people, and why do you pay them that? Would be my second question.
Yeah, there's a long list of APS going and trying to find an equitable place to have rooftop solar, because that's we're sunny, we have lots of opportunity for that, and we're a fairly suburban area. So 1 in 6 to 1 in 7 of our single family homes in our footprint do have rooftop solar. They offset their usage for any amount that they use, and then what they push out to the grid is that we pay them like they're a power producer under a fixed price contract. Now, the goal of this was to move from something that's called net metering, where you get a 1-for-1 credit for that, for whatever you produce that you can use later, and get into an area where we can see a more value-aligned compensation for those folks. So right now in Arizona, if I go for the first 6 months of this year, the average market price during the middle of the day where rooftop solar is generating, somewhere around like $5. You get paid. If it was valueless, it would be more valuable than what that resource timing would be. And so we're paying folks to be able to produce at a time where prices are negatively valued and you have to offload it to somebody at a payment. And so that underlines sort of a need to have us change that. We have changed that. So every year it kind of declines a little bit, and that's intended to be able to give industry an opportunity to adjust to be more value aligned. So rather than just putting solar panels on a roof, they might add energy storage to that value proposition, control of thermostats, or other smart technologies that can do a better job aligning to where value exists. APS has had residential demand rates since the 1980s and time of use rates since the 1990s. And what those are is just a different way to communicate costs to customers so that prices are higher when prices are higher and prices are lower when prices are lower. And in that way, give customers the opportunity to save money by being able to adjust their usage to lower value timeframes.
Sure, and you'd obviously pay for someone to use that energy in lieu of building the storage, which might cost you more than paying someone else to use it. Again, very perverse incentives, but so I want to go to this slide that Mark provided, and I think this will kind of kick off our next discussion here. We got it up on the side TVs here. Mark, can you kind of teach us, through this slide, how technology changes the needs, and we'll probably get back into Jevons Paradox a little more in this discussion and talking about I'll call it the technology needs in these markets that we're talking about particularly.
Yeah, sure. But first, let me add to, not to beat up on utilities, it's the regulators that impose on utilities the structures that they have to do kabuki dances around to accommodate goals and objectives. It's useful to observe in the physics of the universe we live in that everything has an energy cost. And the goal of having a solar panel on a residential roof is ostensibly to cut carbon dioxide emissions because the solar electric panel doesn't emit anything when it's operating. Obviously, in the ecosystem that produced the silicon, something gets emitted, and most of you probably know, but maybe you don't, that over 90% of all the photovoltaic silicon that's manufactured in the world is produced in China on coal-fired grids, because it's a very electric-intensive process to make the silicon that George and I like and think is still going to be around for a long time, roughly 10 times more energy per pound to produce than metallurgical-grade steel. So what you'd want to know is when you have an average house in Arizona with a solar panel on its roof, how much coal was burned to make the panel? And the answer is 30 tons of coal per residential roof of Chinese coal or Australian coal, depending on where it's mined, to produce one, not your house. Your house would be about 150 tons.
Well, we have a guest from Perth here, so we're real glad to have him too. Thank you for the coal.
But the CO2 is emitted into the same atmosphere, and it's unavoidable unless you decide you're going to make the silicon here. And of course, we're not deciding to make the silicon here because it's energy intensive, and we're busy increasing the cost of energy while China's busily building more coal plants to decrease its cost of electricity. So that's a detail that's relevant because the perverse rules that are being put in place by bureaucrats and politicians to do this giant kabuki dance around the evil carbon dioxide are hiding the realities of where carbon dioxide is emitted, not to mention the whole pantheon of other things. And part of the perversion is this trope that we can, quote, dematerialize, get economic growth without energy growth. That's inherent in the International Energy Agency's net zero strategy. It's baked into many policies at the state level and now at the federal level that we can manage growth. And we're talking about this managing growth of energy. We want GDP growth because everybody agrees. You don't have to be an economist to know this is true, right?
Sure.
Jonathan?
Well, you're getting at energy starvation, right? Energy starvation. But I want you to get your slide because I want to talk about using way more energy in the paradigm that we're in.
Well, in the paradigm of the universe we live in, the human beings invent energy demand. That's not an external feature of civilization. It's inherent to civilization. So there was no energy demand for cars before we invented the car. There was no energy demand for computers until we invented the computer. There was no energy demand to make pharmaceuticals until we invented pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry, by the way, is a larger energy consumer in the United States than the chip fab industry, still. And may be larger in the future because of the direction of high consequence therapeutics. So if you think of that in those terms, and you would ask yourself, if we invented and built every possible thing that humans invent and build, well, I mean, the question answers itself. It's silly to think we've invented everything. Graphene, as George and I have talked about, is incredibly energy intensive to make, but so what? Energy is abundant. Energy will be cheap and free. That's not the issue. The economic value of graphene is astronomically greater than its energy cost. The same is true for silicon. But to frame it in ways that are useful for policymakers and for all of us, because BTUs are meaningless metric. In fact, in physics, they're worse than meaningless because they don't accommodate the entropic differences between different energy forms. You know, we measure everything in BTUs, and we make all these comparisons, and we make laws about BTUs. This would be like measuring everything we use in the material world in tons. We would treat a ton of dirt and a ton of gold and a ton of plastic and a ton of water the same way, because they can all be measured in tons. BTUs have no meaning until you add entropy, the features that consume energy to add value, which is to strip chaos out of things and create precision, to create beauty. So that's what humans do when they invent things. What I did is thought, I'm not being successful at communicating BTUs and barrels of oil equivalent. Let's just do dollars. So, and the technology changes. So $1 billion of cars, when you build them and put them on the road, they consume about $200 million of energy over a decade. And that's true whether they're electric or gasoline. It's sort of irrelevant. $1 billion of airplanes consumes more energy over the decade they operate the airplanes, maybe unsurprisingly. Not that much more, because airplanes are optimized to pack you in like cattle. If you put this for, those of you who fly private, the number's bigger, of course. If you do $1 billion of chip fabs, apparently the people in Washington forgot that if you incentivize chip fabs, you need more electricity, but whatever, details, right? 300 million. But the interesting thing is if you build $1 billion of the digital cathedrals that George is correct are reaching their apotheosis, they really are. Engineers always go too far, they always build too big. So we're at peak scale for data centers. You cannot build a data center that people will want that uses a nuclear power plant's worth of electricity. But before NVIDIA, in a data center that does no AI, a decade's worth of energy to supply the data center, the $1 billion of data center, is about $600 million. If I make some of the racks with GPUs, not all of them, then you bump the whole thing up to closer to $2 billion over a decade. So what will happen in the future? Well, George is right. We're going to go wafer scale, and we're going to distribute the power demand. The thing to keep in mind is that while we're focused on data centers, global cloud energy use, only 1/3 of it is in the data centers. The rest is in the networks themselves. 1/3 of it's in the networks, and the other 1/3 is in the distributed systems, manufacturing them and using them. So if we move to an era of greater distributed power use, which we will, and George is completely right on this because of the economic utility of distributing the power of AI into your hand, you eliminate latency. Latency is your enemy. The speed of light is fixed. So you give me inference in my hand, and Katie bar the door. This is a big, big deal. However, what that will do is distribute more of the energy use to the manufacturing of the graphene on silicon carbide. Silicon carbide, by the way, is staggeringly energy intensive to fabricate. I was party to the startup venture that created the first defect-free silicon carbide wafers. That's the holy grail for silicon carbide. Yes, no defects in it. And it's it's diamond, it's synthetic diamond. So you're putting graphene, which is perfect carbon, on synthetic diamond, which is a perfect three-dimensional structure. And this is the future, but the energy used to make these things is an order of magnitude up. We have lots of energy, but once they're distributed, we'll end up in an era which will complicate essentially the problem of control, because as you push energy demands into the system, in the network, then you have more difficulty about ordering people around about how to use it. When it's centralized, whether you're producing it, especially when you're consuming it in a central way, you can beat up in data centers. They're all genuflect to the green narrative because they're centralized.
I want to jump to data centers because they are, from a central perspective, deemed to be super important to the future of what we're talking about, what George talked about. So, Jonathan, can you talk about like using Washington, Oregon? I mean, can you talk about the data centers and the power needs that they have for the utilities in those markets?
Yeah, it's growing, and the forecasts are increasing because of data centers. But the important thing to remember is that for the future, based on these electrification policies, it's not data centers that are driving the increase. It's electric vehicles, and especially it's converting fossil fuel heat and cooling to electricity. That's what's really going to drive. That will probably double electricity demand and double it, the way people use electricity. It's going to double it at night when you have the least amount of wind and solar available.
In comparison, Kent, I think you said last night, you guys don't approve any new data centers. But, I mean, you're building these chip fabs, which, again, with the proliferation of technology, always requires higher energy demand. So what's the difference between those two technologies in your market?
Yeah, first, real quick, want to give some background to that. So we are roughly an 8 gigawatt system. So for simple math, it has taken us 140 years to get to 8 gigawatts of electric demand. We've accepted roughly 4 gigawatts. So 50% growth over the next several years. This is massive growth. It took us 140 years to get to where we're at. And we've been blessed with the CHIPS Act coming to Arizona, so substantial amount of manufacturing.
Can I debate the word blessed? But go ahead.
Fair. We'll hold that for later.
Well, the sun's out. That's always a blessing.
But also substantial amount of data center growth. We also have kind of paused additional data center growth in our service territory for anybody who's a site of 25 megawatts or greater. The reason being is we have 15 gigawatts sitting in queue trying to site in our service territory. That is more than double collectively with the 4 gigawatts we've accepted and then what's in the queue. Now, not all of that would clearly come to our area. It's shopping all over the nation, and that's why you're hearing a lot about kind of the power demands driven by this new technology innovation. That said, our infrastructure is not unlimited, and the infrastructure takes time to develop. In fact, it takes a lot of time to develop. And so we are in a position where we are not putting our customers' reliability in jeopardy. We need to first get where the infrastructure is going to come from, how we're going to manage that, and then also be able to plan for those needs in order to do that. So we've spun up a team of folks who are working on this specific challenge within our organization to try and find out a way that we can kind of enable customers to join in a way that's not going to jeopardize reliability for other customers or affordability.
Sure. Can you just mention, I wasn't thinking correctly, but this made sense when you said, can you explain when your peak energy demand moment in the day is? Like, when do you have your biggest constraint on the system?
Yeah. So our our peak demand is right around 6 p.m. So when the sun is setting, we have the most needs from our customers from us. At that same time, when the sun is setting, that's when we have a substantial amount of our resources dropping off as well, because we have lots of sunshine, lots of solar resources as well. So our biggest risk period really is that 6 p.m. to almost 10 p.m. right now, and anticipated to grow into the future later and later.
Okay. I want to ask, I mean, I think Brian touched the third rail earlier. We'll keep on touching it. We're in political season. It's quite an interesting one if everyone's paying attention. And this is very important for utility policy because as we go out to think about where are the energy needs, right? Those are dominantly in higher density, greater economic growth type of areas. But where the power generation comes from is in rural areas, AKA the demands are in Harris country and the production is in Trump country. Jonathan, can you, just to kind of start this, can you mention, if you look at some of the mandates, like using Washington State, what would you have to do? I think it was I can't remember, solar or wind that you mentioned we'd have to do for surface area in the eastern part of this state.
Well, our analysis showed that for the amount of solar and wind you'd need about 130,000 megawatts of solar, 70,000 megawatts of wind. That's kind of the least cost mix to meet the electrification, along with about 160,000 megawatts of battery storage, which itself would take a huge amount of land area. It would require roughly 30% of the entire land area of both states. So, of east of the Cascades, Trump country, if you will. And people in rural areas are really starting to resent this. They're opposing these huge developments because they bear all the costs and they're not getting into the benefits.
So let's see. What does that look like in Arizona? In other words, I mean, I live in Maricopa County. We are the meal ticket in politics today from a swing state perspective. But Palo Verde is not next to houses. How do you look at these rural power generation places in your jurisdiction in comparison?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely essential, right? So there is a ton of land demands that come along with some of these new types of resources, and a substantial amount of transmission then to deliver them as well. So
And I think you mentioned you kind of had a funny the easements too. I mean, it's not just again. You have to it takes power to move power, and it takes money to do that too. Can you mention just a kind of interesting? You guys were working on getting power from I think you said Western New Mexico, and what you had to do to get it to Maricopa County.
yeah, so actually, this was another entity who's got a massive development in New Mexico who's moving it across, and they were looking for an easement, and one of the folks they came across was like, hey, I'll sell it to you, but you have to buy my whole ranch. And so if you buy my whole ranch, you can have the easement, but otherwise, tough luck. And so now this, developer owns a ranch in the middle of New Mexico.